So we're going to pivot to our final presenter of the conference, and I want to, at the very start, say thank you to Dr. Raj Kumar Singh for joining us. I have a feeling we're about 2 or 3 in the morning where you are, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it is actually 4 a.m. in the morning. So,
Okay. So the
um,
dedication already earns you
yes,
a premier spot in this
thank you.
conference. But Dr. Singh's title for his talk today is From Plateau to Exile: Meat Consumption, Ecology, and Moral Continuity Among Tibetan Refugees. Dr. Singh is an anthropologist specializing in Buddhist economies, refugee studies, and the intersection of religion and market practices in South Asia. He completed his PhD from the University of Delhi, where his research examined Tibetan exile economies in Dharamsala through the lens of Buddhist ethics and informal markets. His work spans economic anthropology, political anthropology, and environmental studies, with publications on Tibetan Buddhism, commodification, and religious communities. He is currently working on an ICSSR funded research project focusing on environmental behavior and employability in India. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Singh.
Thank you, Jonathan, for such a brief introduction. So, yeah, let me just start with my topic. And so, are you guys able to see my screen?
It's loading. Maybe one more moment.
Okay,
Okay, it's on the screen. Yeah.
okay. So, thank you everyone for giving me this opportunity to actually talk about this particular topic. And this has been an ongoing research for the past, I would say, 4 or 5 years, since the time I was there in my field in Dharamshala, Himachal Pradesh, in that Tibetan refugee settlement. And as my work was more related to Buddhism, Buddhist ethics, and economy, and how all of these interact in the market, and one thing that was very common there, that there were many restaurants and hotels that were owned by uh, Tibetan peoples and even by monasteries, and there were specific hotels where monks were there. They were acting as managers, and in between everything, one thing that was going on and on again, that Buddhism always talks about compassion, right livelihood, right consumption. So why all these Tibetan Buddhists, they are consuming meat. Even the monks, leave the lay and lay people, even the monks and nuns, even they are consuming meat. So this something that has been came out from that observation, and from there onwards, I tried to do some research, which I will present here. So yeah, Tibetan, like most of the people who live in the Himalayan plateau, they are historically they have been substantial meat eaters. The reason that they actually tell me all the time, and it has been written there in some of the textbook, is because of the harsh climate, and there was limited availability of vegetables at such a altitude. So imagine the Himalaya is somewhere 10,000 feet, while Tibet is round about 13,000 feet. So obviously the vegetation is very less, and most of the people are nomadic, so they rely on meat consumptions and animal husbandry. And at the same time, when we see that most of the Tibetan, they are overwhelmingly adherent of Mahayana with Buddhism, tradition whose foundation is based on compassion towards not only towards human but towards all sentient beings. And so this is not, it's a century long tension that has been generated extensively. It has led to so many of the textual religious debates and lived religious realities. So the question that I ask, or that I have been working on, is that how this particular tension is being transplanted when Tibetans, they actually move out from their own nation because of certain issues to their to India, where they have got a refuge and they have developed their own refugee settlement. How do they particularly see uh, this tension between vegetarianism, between compassion, being compassionate, and being a meat consuming meat? uh, I was once taking a lecture, like taking an interview with one of the head monks from LTW, Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, and I specifically asked him the question that why do you feel that Tibetans actually eat meat? So the reason he told me was that in India, when they are here in India, they should not, because in Tibet there was a harsh climate, there was less vegetation, but in India you have everything. You have got so many vegetables, but many of them eat because they want to just taste it. So uh, now, moving to some of the literature. So, food and eating have been a long subject of investigation for anthropologists and for scholars of religion. And one of the famous book is from Ravin Thare, The Eternal Food, where he has investigated what he called gastrosemantics of South Asian Buddhist and Hindu and Buddhist culture. And Geoffrey Burstow, in his book Food of the Sinful Demons, Meat, Vegetarianism, and the Limits of Buddhism in Tibet, he actually worked on all the historical texts that were available. And before 1950s, before the Chinese invasion of Tibet, so he tried to understand what was the condition there and what is written in that text. And he has mentioned that there has been a standing tension that has been going on between vegetarian ethics and everyday meat consumption. And you know, Tibetan food is basically divided into two parts. If you divide it into two, one is what we known as kase, that is white food that includes milk, butter, and all these things. While mase, that is the red food that technically means the meat, red meat or meat of a cow or goat or anything. So, you know, when we go through the text, the Mool Sravasti Vida Vinaya, it is the monastic code that is actually followed by most of the Tibetan Buddhists and eventually mainly by the monks and the nuns. So it permits meat consumption under the rule of threefold purity. So what is that threefold purity? Monks and nuns can eat meat if they have neither seen it, neither heard, nor suspected that the animal was specifically killed for them. So these are three rules. You must not see how the animal is being butchered down. You should not even heard it, and you should not. Uh, it should not be sacrificed just for the sake of you being. You will be consuming it. So now, when we again move to other studies, like Studholm, he also did some study, and according to him, that the monastic have always argued that the meat that is bought from the butcher was acceptable because when the butcher was actually butchering that meat, he did not have an image of a monk or a nun in his mind. But the Mahayana tradition, he, it complicates this whole threefold purity. As the Lankavatara Sutra, it devotes actually 12 pages, and where the Buddha himself states that it is wrong to say that I have eaten meat or I will allow my disciple to eat meat. So this is where the contrast come. Now, with Vajrayana, because many of the Tibetans they still follow that tantric tradition, and it adds an extra layer of complexity where they can use five kinds of meat, Panchamamansa, that includes human, cow, dog, elephant, and horse for advanced tantric practices. So in Vajrayana feast, which we call as ritual, that five meats that are acceptable, and they symbolize the transcendence of dualistic categories such as pure, impure, rather than permission for everyday meat consumption. Many Tibetans they have interpreted this narrow historic view not as ritualized transgression but as a general license for meat consumption. And it has been criticized by figure like Patrol Rinpoche. And there is also a doctrine which many of the monks will always talk about, that liberation through consumption. So they believe that if they are consuming an animal, they are liberating them. So again, you know that many of the monks are against it. Like Jigme Lingpa, he himself said that I do not have this confidence that if I will eat someone or I will eat an animal, that is going to liberate him. Now, there are vegetarian counter tradition and bodhisattva bow. So, Eastern, most of the like Tibet is divided into three major parts, you can say. And the eastern part, there are Tibetan masters like Jigme Lingpa, Patru Rinpoche, Shapkar, and Apema Damdul. They have argued that compassion should not only be for humans, we should be compassionate towards all sentient beings. And how we can be compassionate? The first point is to abstain from meat. Okay, you should not consume meat. So their strongest argument about being a vegetarian or not consuming meat is based on Mahayana Bodhisattva Vo, which believes that we should work for betterment, for liberation of all sentient beings. Since one cannot claim to work for universal liberation while participating in animal slaughter. So the Vo has argued to supersede the Vinayas lower path permission to eat meat. So this is in, Bodhisattva Vo is in direct, you can say, conflict with the earlier Vinaya. Yet this counter tradition never became a majority practice, and its doctrine and emotional force coexisted, but people still are consuming it. Now, meat as a necessary evil, when I talk to some of the monks or to the people, and even some of the text also say that they consume, most of the Tibetan, they consume meat because although it is ethically uncomfortable, because they are Buddhists, they are follower of Buddha, but it's a psychological, physiological necessity, it's a biological necessity. And for nomadic Tibetans in particular, who are rearing animals, their entire livelihood depends on it. So, based on in his book, he has mentioned that there is a strong association between meat eating, masculinity, strength, and prosperity in Tibet. And people who eat meat are believed to be more prosper, and they are more proper men, a provider, a person of substance. While with vegetarian, if you are a vegetarian, a vegan, it risks being read as emasculating, and a rejection of values pastoral culture prizes the most. Now, many of the contemporary vegetarianism, practices that we see, they are religious and political movement. The contemporary period, you will find that even His Holiness Dalai Lama, Karmapa, Trinley Dorji, they have in publicly they have told that you have to people should reduce or abandon meat. And there is a very famous case study when Dalai Lama, when he came to India and he find out that many of the Hindu sadhus, they abstain from meat eating. So he himself started, abandoning the meat, that I will be consuming a vegetarian diet. But then he fell sick, and his personal physician told him that you should consume a bit of meat, if not as food, then consume it in the form of medicine, because you are coming from Tibet. It's a very harsh and cold climate, and you are living in Himachal Pradesh, Dharamshala, which is again, the winters are long. So your body need that kind of protein. Your body need that kind of warmth, and which you will only get from the protein. Okay. And Sturdham, again, he has reported that there are entirely meat-free monasteries. The monasteries won't be cooking meat. And restaurant in contemporary Kham, where the menu, like there are two different menus. One is divided for vegetarian, another is divided for non-vegetarian. And consuming meat is not only a purely religious choice, it's also political, because senior religious leaders, they advocate for to represent an attempt to reshape food culture around Mahayana ethics, and which is again in tension with Chinese state economic policies in Tibetan area. Now, if we theorize beyond Tibet, like there are comparative perspective from different religion, Catherine Will's work in Kinship and Killing, it has examined how religion negotiate the ethical tension between compassion for animal and the justification for meat consumption. Similarly, Aaron Gross' work, The Question of the Animal and Religion, Theoretical Stakes and Practical, they have introduced the concept of humane subject, arguing that religious tradition negotiate the tension between human dominance over animal and compassion towards them. Carol J. Adams, in his book The Sexual Politics of Meat, they have demonstrated that the close relationship between meat consumption, masculinity, power, and providing a framework for understanding the cultural meaning of meat across different societies. Now, food in Tibetan society is also a ritual medium. And Garrett and colleagues, they have shown that, uh, while performing medicine rituals, physicians of like Tibetan physicians, they show that food is not incidental to Tibetan Buddhist rituals. It is the very medium through which ritual narrative unfold. And Torma, which is a kind of, you can say a idol that is being decorated, usually made from roasted barley flour and butter. It can simultaneously serve as deity's temporary residence, a ransom for malicious practice, a stand-in for sick person, and literal food. Peaceful trauma uses three white and three sweet substance, while wrathful trauma, that is for a malicious spirit, it incorporates meat, blood, and alcohol. So here we can see that even when they are performing ritual, meat is used. And the first Dalai Lama, which wrote a text on Torma rituals, he described it as an elaborate taxonomy of divine guests, each requiring different hospitalities. The three jewels, Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, they receive offering like tax paid to a king, protected deities are feasted like friends, while demons are appeased as one repays them. So the matter of argument is that food in Tibetan Buddhism has always carried a double register: sacred obligation and everyday sustenance. Simultaneously, long before displacement added a market economy as the third register where we will move over. So now how food actually changes is how it changes in a tourist economy. So Dharamshala is the second capital of Himachal Pradesh, and as we can see, the number of tourists are increasing day by day. It actually started, the whole idea of tourism in Dharamshala, it started with Dalai Lama receiving the Nobel Prize. Once he received the Nobel Prize, there was a huge uh, visitors that came from European nations, and there was a hippie trail that keeps on. And with international visitor, more and more national tourists also started coming. So this is what the research, like most of the previous research has asked about. They have worked about how this religion and like Buddhism and meat consumption interact in Tibet. So my research is more about how it interact in a Tibetan refugee settlement where they are not permanent citizens. They are refugee. They are dependent on still dependent on certain aids that are receiving from US and other European nations, while they have now, after 50 years, they have established their own livelihood. So yeah, it was an ethnographic fieldwork that was conducted around McLeodganj Dharamshala. And let me move to the findings. So what I find out in my research that, you know, meat is consuming meat is an embedded practice. It's not a moral contradiction for the Tibetans. Whatever the text says, it's a different thing, but the way lived religion or lived Buddhism is being practiced in the refugee settlement is much more different than what is there in some of the Mahayana Buddhist texts. So most of the interviews, they describe that eating or selling meat as a moral crisis. You know, it's actually not a moral crisis or betrayal of Buddhist identity. They described it in a matter of fact that practical terms. At times, we have to look for practicality rather than what is there in the doctrinal logic. Meat, usually Tibetans, they do not butcher meat. So most of the butchers, they are ideas Indian or Nepali, and Tibetan, they don't own any shop like that. Religious injections against meat coexist with everyday meat consumptions because ethical ideas and daily practices operate in different spheres. Uh, the former as moral aspiration, while the later as responses to lived realities. What is distinct in this refugee context is that This anonymizing logic is now mediated by an entirely non-Tibetan market butcher, supplier, and food system that are Indian rather than Tibetans. So in Tibet, Tibetans are bustling down, but in India, Tibetans are not doing it. It's usually the Indian or the Nepalis that have been settled in this particular area for the past, like at the from the time British era. Now, market structure, livelihood, and reinterpretation of compassion. For most of the restaurant owner, those who are Tibetans and they specifically cook meat, so it is not primarily a religious question but a livelihood question because they have to cater a lot of tourists, and food accounts for roughly a quarter of tourist spending in Dharamshala. And if these restaurants they do not serve meat, it carries direct economic cost and which many family cannot absorb. Several informant reframe this pressure in ethical terms of their own, like they have to look for their family, and like doing good for the family was also a compassionate act. And even many of them said that we donate some money to the monastery and we feel that we are not doing any harm. And you know like donation or looking for family, or even donating to some other needy that are there, or even providing food to some other people, it draws Buddhist ethics again to a new kind of interpretation where we have to look like what actually compassion mean. Does it mean that if you are even if you are serving meat while you are donating money, or you are working uh, providing food to some other people, do they balance each other, or like is there any contradiction? And notably, there are certain very small restaurant where you will find that they are not providing like non-vegetarian food on certain days. Of course, not on all days, but on certain days they are avoiding. Like usually on Wednesday, you won't find like Tibetan restaurant. Most of the Tibetan restaurant they won't sell non-vegetarian diet on. Again, generation, gender, and shifting moral vocabulary. So older informant that actually who remembered the pre-exile Tibet, they frame meat consumption using the older idiom of necessity and health. Younger, by contrast, they frame that their food choices, whether vegetarian or flexitarian or unrestricted, they are their personal choices, and they are not. They are more connected to global discourses of health or environmentalism. And the gender division, again, it's very important because usually in Tibet women used to manage white food, that is milk, butter, and all these things, while men used to manage red food. But in India that has changed because now women are managing both because they are working in restaurant and in the market context, so they are managing both, like red meat and all these things. And this pattern also suggests that the moral economy of meat in Dharamshala is not static. It is again being renegotiated by each cohort using whatever vocabulary, religious, economic, generational, or global, it feels more persuasive and most livable to them. Now, meat consumption among Tibetan is not, you cannot understand it as a failure to live up with Buddhist ideal, nor as a evidence to those ideals no longer matter. It is understood as an embedded practice continuously reinterpreted with economic and social condition of exile. And there is no as such simple relation between religious doctrine and everyday food practices. And this holds true perhaps when the practice is relocated into the informal tourist driven market economy of a refugee settlement. And ethical decisions making around food is usually mediated by necessity, cultural continuity, and a real livelihood constant. And Buddhist ethics, as I find out, that it is not a fixed rule book among the refugees that they have to either follow or they fail to follow. So while concluding, meat consumptions, you know, the ethnographic evidence shows that food practices, they are embedded in refugee livelihood, market structure, and the material realities of exile, where ethical ideals are continually negotiated in everyday life. Rather than representing a contradiction, meat consumption reflects a moral economy in which compassion, necessity, cultural continuity, and economic survival coexist, and they are trying to constantly balance. And again, the study also believes that that Buddhist ethics, or for any ABC religious ethics, it's we have to move beyond what is written in the text, and we have to go more towards the lived realities of religion. So thank you everyone.